In an interesting and sometimes paradoxical way, Alabama has been in the vanguard of much of the change that has taken place in America. Works of history will no doubt document abundantly our state's role in the changing of the world's order. A great deal of that history has already been written by people like our guest today. He arrived in Alabama nearly a half-century ago, a product of humble beginnings on the Oklahoma-Texas border. A member of the military press corps stationed at Alabama bases, he opted to remain here upon separation from the military, living in Selma for a time before relocating to Montgomery. In Selma, at the ripe old age of 19, he started his own newspaper and then became city editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. In the mid-1950s, he authored the very first report on the famous bus boycott. He has received numerous awards for journalistic excellence and has written a regular newspaper column for upwards of 40 years. He is a humorist, political consultant, and nationally known speaker. We are proud to welcome Joe Azbell, one-to-one. Thank you, Mr. Azbell, for being with us this afternoon. So let's talk about the Dust Bowl, the Texas-Oklahoma border.
All right.
You were born there.
I was born there.
And you left home very early.
I left home when most children are going into junior high school. And I've been out in the world ever since.
Why did you leave home so early?
Well, there was too many kids and too many mouths to feed. This was the Dust Bowl. We were very, very poor. My father, who was a tenant farmer, had died. My mother, who at that time could not read and write, she later learned. She took in washing and ironing and did what she could, but there were just too many mouths to feed, and there wasn't any food. There wasn't anything, so one day I went out on the highway and started hitchhiking, and I ended up in Montgomery, Alabama.
You finally ended up in Montgomery.
Today.
Yes. Well, your father passed away when you were a very young child.
7 years old.
You left home in your early teens. So you never really had the benefit of a strong parental influence in your life during your formative years.
I shined shoes and sold newspapers on the street. I was gone from home about 13 hours out of the 24 hours. I was at home maybe an hour other than sleeping. I never had any parental guidance or from either my mother or my father.
Have you ever felt that to be a missing chapter in your life? The fact that that was not there for you?
When I got married, my wife told me one time I was underprivileged, and she said, "You had an underprivileged childhood." And I said, "Why do you say it?" She told me why, and I said, "I never thought about it. I really didn't think about being underprivileged." I was very lucky. I had many people help me. Wonderful people helped me. I washed pots, washed dishes, I picked peaches, I pulled bows. In Texas, you pull bows. In Alabama, you pick cotton. The difference is you pull the whole bowl in Texas. I went to California, to Kansas, worked on newspapers in Missouri, went to New York, went to Mexico. I just roamed around. Little boy, just roaming around, hitchhiking. Wanted to ride the freights, but I never had enough courage to get on one.
Who are some of these people that you remember most that had some influence in your early life? Who were some of your heroes?
Well, I suppose the person that had the most influence in my life was the person who said, "If it is to be, it's up to me." I don't know who said it, but it was one of the most wonderful things that was ever said to me. The other thing was that this ain't no hill for a climber, and I always had those two things to fall back on. And I worked in, I guess the man who had the most influence on my childhood, I worked in a newspaper office in Kansas. And there was an old man named Uncle Charlie Ross. And he sent me to get these syrup buckets full of beer. I was about 14. And
syrup buckets?
Syrup buckets. And they would fill them up with beer. You know, beer wasn't
legal.
He went over to the bootlegger and gave him, I think I gave him a quarter. That's what it cost for a syrup bucket full of beer. And I had to bring back these two syrup buckets. And one day I walked in the office and I gave him the beer and he said, you know, Joe, you're going to be a success in this world. And I was so starved for someone to tell me something nice. And I said, why did you say that, Uncle Charlie? And he said, I'll tell you why. He said, you're four-eyed, you can't see, you got an impediment in your speech, you're the worst worker we ever had. There's never been anybody in this office that was as bad as a worker. You sleep in the back on some newsprint back there. He says, boy, you're going to be a success because you can't go but one way, that's up.
That's up.
And so I knew I was a success. I never had to worry about that.
You didn't have a lot of formal classroom training. You left school also very early.
I worked on newspapers. I worked in a newspaper office in Kansas where they printed the little blue books. That was the first condensed books. The Ruby out of Omaha Cayenne, Shakespeare, Hamlet, Othello, all those books I read. And you see, I had to worry about getting picked up by the police because I was a truant by any, if I got picked up by the police, I was off to one of two places, reform school or an orphan home. So I learned very young that the one place they don't look for a truant is in the library. So I'd go to the library and get my books, and I'd read the books in the library when I had time and what have you. And I could never have the thought came to me, I could never have a friend. And the reason is I could keep myself out of trouble, but I didn't know if my friend, you know, if he got in trouble, I could keep myself out of the trouble that he might get in. So I didn't do that. I lived at YMCA's, and I was a big tall boy, and they thought I was older. And I lived in rooming houses. And if I couldn't get a job in a newspaper, I could always get a job washing dishes or washing pots, or I would go over and work free of charge at the newspaper until they needed me.
Mm-hmm. You enlisted in the military at a fairly early age.
That's right.
What was then known as the Army Air Corps.
That's right.
That's how you got to Montgomery.
They sent me, when I went into service, the guy gave me an AGCT test. And he said, he listed my education. He couldn't believe that, you know, I had not been in high school. And he said, let's check you here. And so he started checking the thing, and he said, you're 132 on your ACGT. And I said, yeah, that's what you say. He said, well, let's just make you high school graduate. So he marked it high school graduate on my work. And the next thing I knew, I was at Denver, Colorado, in administrative specialist school. And I went through that, and I was the top of the class there. And so when they spawned the Air University, they asked for, I went to some other schools, and they asked for the top people and enlisted men with AGCTs. And they sent me to Maxwell. And that's how I got out there.
That's how you got to Maxwell Air Force Base. On a scale of 1 to 10, and you have spoken reverently of your military experience and your military service.
It made me everything. Without it, I don't know what I would be.
On a scale of 1 to 10, you would rate it what?
12.
12. Somewhere in 1946 and 47, after a military stint at Maxwell, you moved to Selma,
That's right.
Alabama. You married a Selma girl and settled down there to make a living. What was Selma like in 46 and 47?
Well, it was still a part of the Confederate States of America. It was the most beautiful little town you ever saw. The most beautiful people, sweet people, dear people, but they were still Johnny Reb. The Confederate Memorial Day was a sacred event. People in Selma, though, I just never understood the town. I never understood the people, and I was an outsider. I had this newspaper I had started. I had been I was the original founding editor of the Air University Dispatch at Maxwell Air Force Base. And I left that and went to and found this paper.
At 19?
At 19 years of age. And you can imagine, here was this outsider. Now, there was a man in Selma, they tell this story anyway, about a man in Selma who was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and he was brought to Selma a week after he was born. And when he died, they said, Bill Smith, a native of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, because that's the way they look at you.
That's not very accepting of outsiders.
You were nothing. In fact, I was absolutely nothing, not only to the people in Selma, but to my in-laws. They didn't think of me. I was a soldier. You know, that wasn't much. And that's all the qualification I had. But Selma was a beautiful town, beautiful people. It had a routine, the Albert Hotel, it had Swift Drugstore, the Wilby Theater. It had all these things. And people that were, anybody who lived in West Selma, and if you were from East Selma, you were from East Selma. And people walked on one side of the street, West Selma, West Broad, the west side of Broad. And you didn't walk on the east side of Broad unless you were from that part of town. It was a very strange doings.
Has Selma changed all that much over, over the last 40, 45 years?
Oh, Selma today is the epitome of a destroyed community. The people who are in Selma love Selma, and they're sweet people and they're nice people, black and white. I have many black friends in Selma and many white friends, and it's pitiful to see a town just completely torn apart by racial conflict in 1990, which is all these years since the Civil Rights Voting Act was passed because of the Selma March. It should never have happened. You know, this racial conflict that goes on today. I wish there was a way for the people to get back together and for the old Selma to survive.
Do you think so? Do you think it's possible? Has there been irreparable damage done?
I don't think it could ever get back together. I think there are people in Selma who own homes who, if they could sell their homes, they would move. It's unfortunate, but it's a fact that they just kind of stuck there.
Let's pause for just a minute. Not only has Joe Azbell written extensively about politicians in his day, he's also served as speechwriter and consultant to some of them, most notably several former Alabama governors. We'll test his political acumen in retrospect. Our guest is Joe Azbell, who is a writer, a humorist, a political consultant, and many other things. How did you become involved in politics other than as a newspaper reporter?
I think that I've always loved people. When I shined shoes, I learned as a little boy, I started shining shoes on the streets when I was 5 years old. And I was selling newspapers on the streets when I was 5 years old with newspapers wrapped inside me to keep myself warm. And those Texas northers are bad. But I learned that you could look at a man and tell he was going to let you shine his shoes or not, and if he was going to buy paper. And so human nature and psychology of people, I was just fascinated by it, even as a little boy, guessing which one would and wouldn't have a shoe shine. And then politics came along, and we had W.E.O. Daniels in Texas, and he was a Jim Folsom type, like Huey Long and what have you. But it was a great, he ran against the Gold Dust Twins, who were James V. Allred and Dan Moody. And I handed out the W.E.O. Daniel News for W.E.O. Daniels, and they paid me 50 cents a day to do it. And I got to go with the bus from towns around where I was there on the Texas border. And I got interested in politics.
So you've always been intrigued
I just loved it.
by politics.
I loved the thing that was there.
The first Alabama governor, then, with whom you had an intimate association with, was Big Jim Folsom.
And with all of his family.
Yes.
Cornelia, Ruby, Fred, Jim Jr., all of them. His wife, Jamel, they're the nicest people in the world. And I met him in Ben Tucker's shop in Clanton, where I was printing my newspaper. And he came in with these big feet, this great big tall giant of a man. And he asked me if I would help him with the Folsom Forum and the Old Age Pension News, which were his two papers, and I did. And I wrote, and then he asked me if I'd write him a little speech or two. And so Gould Beach was writing speeches for him and some others, and I wrote him a couple of speeches, and he used some of them, and not all of them, but he picked up a line here, and I liked those things that he would talk about, those little anecdote things that were just fantastic, and I wrote some of those for him.
He was considered, I guess, as true a populist as has surfaced in the political scene in the state of Alabama. Would you consider him a populist, and would you consider his politics somehow ahead of its time?
Well, it was ahead of its times. Mailbox roads, old age pension. He was fulfilling needs of people. This little woman in the gingham dress, this guy that had this oil-stained straw hat and this stubble of beard and paint-spattered shoes, and wore overalls, not overalls, but overalls, washed in a pot.
There is a difference.
He taught them. He taught the language that they understood, and they identified with him. And when he said, "Y'all come," they thought that he truly meant, "Y'all come to the mansion." Mm-hmm. And there will be a "y'all come too," and that will be Jim Folsom Jr.
Yes.
One of these days.
Yes. George Wallace, you worked as a political speechwriter also for
Yes.
George Wallace.
And I came up with "Send Them a Message" and some of his other slogans.
You actually created
Yes.
this slogan, "Send Them a Message," which he used during his presidential campaigns.
That's right.
Across the country. How did you come up with that? What was behind?
Well, it was a thing that happened. Charles Snyder, who was director of the campaign, told me, he said, "Joe, we need a slogan." I said, "Okay." So I went and I put down 10 slogans. I came back in and he says, "Okay," I looked at him, "which one do you like?" And I said, "I like the one at the bottom. Send them a message." He said, "Okay, we'll go with it." And so Hugh Powell in Jacksonville, Florida, had bought about 300 billboards in Florida. And so he called me and he said, "What's our slogan going to be? We need to put them on the billboards." I said, "Send them a message. Vote George Wallace for president." And so he did that. And the first time Wallace knew his slogan was "Send them a message" was when he looked up and saw a billboard and it said, "Send them a message." He came in my office on the way when he came back, and he says, "We came up with a good slogan, did we, Joe?" Mm-hmm. And he loved the slogan, and it made, and that was called message politics. And it invented a whole new thing in American politics that's called today message politics in the style of Wallace.
Your experiences have been so rich and so vast. You've done so many things. You were the first reporter as city editor of Montgomery Advertiser to write a report about the impending Montgomery bus boycott, and right. You were intimately associated with many of the players who were closely associated with the boycott movement. How did you feel being the reporter who actually penned the first report having to do with the Montgomery bus boycott?
Well, Tracy, the first report was one thing. You know, when you look back and what have you, you can be a complete genius, you know, looking backward. I didn't know it was going to be the greatest thing in the world until on Monday that night when they had the meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church, and I wrote this the next day. They had that crowd there, and King made his speech, and the others made their speeches, and I saw what was happening, and I said that this will be a movement which will become worldwide, and that it will be the spark that lights the flame that will become a mass movement.
You actually envisioned
yes,
that?
And that's been reprinted. I'm in many, many books. I'm probably in, I don't know, scores of books, but the most recent books, of course, Eyes on the Prize. We did Eyes on the Prize. And I'm in it extensively in the book, Eyes on the Prize. And there's a new book called Voices of Freedom, where they quote that article on the Holt Street. And there's many, many others. But what I saw there at that meeting was more important than what I saw that morning when that first bus rolled in. That meeting was the key that told you that something was going on. And I was asked recently the question, what did the bus boycott accomplish? What did this thing? You see, these people, by listening to King and what have you, they were walking with Jesus. They weren't walking for freedom. They weren't walking for equality. They were walking with Jesus. It was a religious movement that was held in churches. And a lot of people don't understand that. And in the movie Three Came to Cawdor, Gary Cooper said that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the control of fear. And I think that the boycott taught these people how to control fear. And that was the key to it.
You were the chief witness at Martin Luther King's trial. Right. Many people said that some of the statements that you made during that trial took also an extraordinary amount of courage.
Well, I don't know that it took courage, Tracy. I told the truth. I was asked questions. And Fred Gray asked me these questions. And the prosecutor asked me the questions. And I told the truth. And what I had seen there and what had happened there. Martin Luther King, for example, saved my life up at the bombing of his home on Jackson Street. I had to say the truth, is that he came out and told these people to put down your guns, put down your knives, and put down your chains, and go home. And if he hadn't done that, I may not be here today. And it could have really been a riot, because when you bombed that house, and with that emotional feeling that was going in this community, there was no telling what would have happened.
We have left. Give me the first thought that comes to your mind when I mention the names of these people. Martin Luther King.
Greatest speaker in America.
George Wallace.
Master politician.
Cornelia Wallace.
Sadness, and sadness even to this day.
You've known several presidents, among them George Bush.
He's a product of the system, American political system.
The former chairman of the Alabama Republican Party and mayor of the city of Montgomery, Emory Fulmer.
Probably the savviest person I know, and he's one of the best friends on earth to have. Most underestimated by most people.
Big Jim Folsom.
He is a great, great memory.
Attorney Morris Dees.
I wish I had his courage.
Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr.
His father was called Straight Edge, and that's what he is, straight edge.
Paul Hubbard.
Probably the smartest man that's ever been in lobby work in Alabama. Took the place of Ed Reed, who was the smartest.
Guy Hunt.
The egg man. He sold eggs at the Birmingham Farmers Market. He's underestimated. He's smart. He's crafty. Knows what he's doing. Never think the man's not smart.
It's been a delightful conversation. We really appreciate your joining us this afternoon on One-to-One.
It's my great pleasure.
We've been speaking one-to-one this afternoon with Joe Azbell, writer, humorist, political consultant, humanitarian. As institutions go, he is among the better grounded ones in the state of Alabama. His encyclopedic knowledge of the state of Alabama, its history, its politics, qualifies him as something of a treasure. He's touched many lives and enlightened many minds. His lifelong contributions have done much to change the landscape of Alabama and America.